From London, I'm Rochelle Travers, and this is The Standard. A moment for the history books, as Donald Trump becomes the first former or serving US president to be convicted of a crime.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here.
Mr. Trump has hit out after being convicted on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in his criminal trial in New York. Sentencing is due to take place on the 11th of July, and there is a possibility of a potential prison sentence. Although experts say a fine is more likely, he's expected to appeal regardless. The verdict comes as he campaigns to defeat Joe Biden in November's US election. And despite the conviction, Trump can still run. Jitendra Joshi is The Standard's deputy political editor. Jit, just explain to our listeners the background of this case and what has Donald Trump been found guilty of?
This is pretty historic stuff playing out at the moment. It's the first time a former president has been convicted of a crime, and it relates to a payment of $130,000 that Mr. Trump paid to his then right-hand man and lawyer, Michael Cohen. This was just ahead of the 2016 presidential election. They had got wind that Stormy Daniels, an adult movie star, was claiming that she'd had an affair with Trump. And it was right around the same time, if you recall, there was a huge controversy over a leaked audio in which Trump was heard boasting that he grabbed women by the genitalia and get away with it. The last thing his campaign needed right then was another scandal. So the allegation, or what is now proven in court, is that the lawyer Cohen bought Stormy Daniels off and bought her silence to prevent this rocking the boat ahead of that election when Donald Trump went on to beat Hillary Clinton. So it's now been proven in court that his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, did pay off that money to Stormy Daniels. But crucially, the conviction relates not so much to the payment itself, or that Trump was lying about his relations with Stormy Daniels. It's how it was processed. In other words, it was a false business record. Cohen was able to claim it as a business expense, and the court and the jury in New York has now agreed that actually it was a hush money payment and it was not a legitimate business expense at all. And therefore, Trump lied to New York state authorities, but also more widely to voters, to American voters, by concealing what really had gone on then.
What are the potential sentences he's facing?
The extreme scenario, he could go to jail for up to 4 years on the charge of falsifying business records. Or he, more likely, it seems, according to legal experts, he faces a fine of $5,000 for each of the 34 counts on which he was convicted. So what does that come to? $170,000 if my maths is correct. So the fine in and of itself is fairly small beer, especially compared to another fine that he's recently managed to rack up in New York, which is for $355 million. And that relates to a civil case in which he was found guilty by a judge of lying to banks when he was raising money in loans about the sort of collateral he was putting up. That bigger fine has become a bit of an issue, actually. During the campaign, Trump is having to use a lot of the money he's getting from donors, from political donors, to defray his legal expenses. So the money is in this Stormy Daniels case, by comparison, is fairly inconsequential. And as I say, it doesn't feel like, from what we're hearing from legal experts, that he'll end up in jail for this hush money payment because it's a first offence. It's seen as a white-collar crime. And the judge in the case, if you recall, one of the issues that the judge was having to deal with during the trial was Trump's frequent and loud outbursts inside the courtroom and outside when he was trying to question the legitimacy of the whole process, by accusing the judge of being biased, of saying that the jury couldn't be trusted and so on. So during that process, the judge was at pains to say, look, Trump, you have to stop doing this. I'm going to keep fining you for it. I could put you in jail for contempt of court even, but I really don't want to do that because it would have so many implications for the presidential election. So by extension, now that we're at the sharp end of things, now that he's been convicted, how's the judge going to play it? Based on what he said before, it would feel like jail time is possibly a stretch too far for this judge. But we'll have to see on July the 11th when the sentencing happens.
Let's go to the ads. Coming up in part 2, Dr Leslie Vinjamuri, Director of the US and Americas Program at Chatham House, on the significance of Donald Trump's conviction and whether or not it could impact the US election. Welcome back. Here to look at the wider significance of Donald Trump's conviction and whether or not it could impact the US election in November is Dr Leslie Vinjamuri, Director of the US and Americas Program at Chatham House.
The former president of the United States of America was found guilty on all 34 counts of which he was on trial for. And so we have, for the first time ever in the history of the United States, a felon who is set to be the Republican nominee and stand and be on the ballot when Americans go to the polls in the presidential election. It's unprecedented. It is, in comparative perspective of the many trials that the former president is confronted by, it is the one that many people see to be the least offensive of all the charges. This is, of course, the charges relate to his sexual relationship with Stormy Daniels and the payment that he made to her so that she wouldn't speak out, and with the intention of ensuring that Americans weren't aware of this before the 2016 presidential election. So it really is a case that was very much about obstruction of electoral interference on the part of the former president. But it hasn't, for many people, risen to the level of those cases related to the January 6th attacks and assaults on the Capitol, or to charges against Trump for keeping those intelligence files in Florida. So, but nonetheless, this is very significant. For some people, I guess it's become a little bit normalized. People are used to President Trump, who plays by his own rules, who doesn't take note of due process, who had 10 gag orders in the course of this trial and ignored all of them, who was clearly, very temperamental in the courtroom, and seen to be in contempt of court at different points in time. So I think the entire pattern of behavior is quite extraordinary. The findings of him being guilty are extraordinary. The timing is extraordinary. He's going to be sentenced. The sentencing will be announced on July 11th, just days before the Republican National Convention that will take place in Milwaukee. It's really extraordinary. The problem, of course, is that it's become so normalized to have this kind of figure in the United States, and the entire political context is so phenomenally polarized that what we're seeing now are many Americans talking about the weaponization of the court system against the former president. This language is coming from the Republican Party. It's coming from the former president himself. It's creating further erosion of trust in institutions, and specifically an erosion of trust in the courts. Donald Trump has attacked the courts on many occasions throughout his presidency and since. But I think that, the thing to just note here is that the trial went forward. It was a fair trial, and it's led to an extraordinary result, every single count. And people really weren't sure how this would come out. So many people thought it would be a hung jury that wouldn't come to a decision, that we might see a mistrial. Right up until the last minute, people really weren't certain how this would unfold.
As you mentioned, the timing of all this is truly remarkable. Could the timing of Trump's conviction affect his campaign?
I think it will. Certainly, he will use this as fodder for his line, which is that the Democrats are trying to obstruct a free and fair election, or trying to put him on trial in order to diminish his prospects, that he's very popular and that they're threatened by him. We've heard this rhetoric. It will only get worse The proximity to the Republican National Convention is very significant. It's very clear that Donald Trump's base is rallying around him and has very much bought into the line that the Democrats had control of the court, that the court has been weaponized against the former president. This will more likely than not simply solidify their support for Donald Trump. But the real question is how these judgments, the determination of Trump being guilty, again, on all 34 counts, how it will affect the independent voters that lean Republican. Will they decide that they simply don't want to be associated with a presidential candidate that is a convicted felon? And there's a real question about how this will affect women. This is a case that certainly raises all sorts of questions about Donald Trump's treatment of women at a time when many Americans are deeply concerned about the assault on women's reproductive rights that stem from the rollback of Roe versus Wade. And the Republican Party is seen as being at the sort of vanguard of rolling back those reproductive rights. And even though they're distinct sets of issues, they come together, they coalesce around this question of how Republican leaders and elected officials and the president, the former president himself, how they treat women. And if you look at polling on Republican voters, just over 30% of them are not enthusiastic. They're not enthusiastic about the election. They're either not too enthusiastic or not enthusiastic at all. And those are people that need to turn out and vote if Donald Trump is going to be elected. That matters a lot. It matters especially in swing states. And again, these announcements that came down just recently are more likely than not to really have an impact on women and on those reluctant Republican voters, many of whom voted for Nikki Haley. They were seeking an alternative. We've seen this in the data. And Nikki Haley's recently announced that she will vote for Donald Trump, but whether in light of this, she can really bring her voters along remains to be seen. I'm quite skeptical.
And it is those swing states in particular that are always so crucial, aren't they? Do we know the types of issues that they care about and whether this conviction is something that could impact their vote?
Well, I think we're going to have to watch the polling in the days ahead. And, what we know about American voters is they vote on, inflation. In other words, what are they paying for food, for gas? What are they paying for rent or for their mortgages? In other words, their daily living costs. And on that dimension, President Biden hasn't done well. Trump is seen to be better on the economy by many voters, including in those swing states and including in that demographic of low-income working class voters that really both candidates are vying for their votes. But again, there are a lot of voters that are ambivalent in this election. They're ambivalent about President Biden. They're ambivalent about President Trump. And the election will come down to how many voters are willing to really make the effort to cast their vote. A lot of voters might stay home. And that's simply a question of the math. Whose voters stay home? And when you see a candidate about whom you're already, slightly ambivalent, and then you get these charges, I think that has the ability. It's a difficult one to measure. If they're not voting on, the question of trials and guilt or innocence, they're voting on sort of character and on a bucket of economic issues. Immigration will be very significant, but that lack of enthusiasm, when you see the moral credibility of your candidate, it's always been there. It's always been there for Donald Trump, but to have that formal decision made by a court, for many people, I think that will be very off-putting. The other thing to really watch in the days ahead, just recently, we've seen a number of very wealthy individual donors who had pulled back from Donald Trump after the January 6th attacks on the Capitol. Some of them have now moved back and said that they will support President Trump. A few of them had sort of indicated that, but not decided. And again, this is now an open question. How does it play in light of these decisions to have, your name associated with a presidential candidate who's a convicted felon when you've got a reputation to consider, all sorts of business interests? I think that, this is a very interesting space to watch. How do these donors, what judgments do they make? And at the moment, it's very difficult because there isn't an alternative. But watch what happens on July 11th with the sentencing, watch the process of appeal, and then see how that plays out. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention.
You can read more about Donald Trump and the US election in the Standard newspaper or on our website, standard.co.uk. And that's it from this episode. This podcast will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m.